Welcome to Intersections, a podcast of Seton Hall's Institute for Communication and Religion and Interreligious Studies Media, spotlighting conversations with authors featured in the Journal of Interreligious Studies, along with scholars, educators, and community organizers in the field. Greetings and welcome to another episode of Intersections. Fratelli tutti. With these words, St. Francis of Assisi addressed his brothers and sisters and proposed to them a way of life marked by the flavor of the gospel. This saint of fraternal love, simplicity, and joy prompts me once more to devote this new encyclical to fraternity and social friendship. These are from the opening lines of Pope Francis's 2020 encyclical letter on fraternity and social friendship. And just as Pope Francis was inspired by St. Francis to write the letter, it seems my guest today, Matthew Cavadan, was inspired in part by Francis's encyclical to write his article on fraternal pluralism, which appeared in issue 47 of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. Matthew Cavadan is the former Robert Poole Fellow in Law and Religion at the Emory University Center for the Study of Law and Religion, a former public defender, and current director of the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice, among many other previous positions. Although I should add that he is appearing on this podcast today, not in his capacity as director in the Cato Institute's project. He's taught law school courses on criminal law and procedure, as well as the First Amendment, and has published on both law and religion and how they have intersected historically and today. Welcome, Matthew. I'm very glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's nice to reconnect. You and I, of course, got to know each other originally back at Harvard Divinity School. I was an undergraduate during your studies there. So I appreciate the invitation to reconnect at this point in our lives and talk about some big ideas together.
Yes, I'm really excited about this. It's good to see you, good to hear your voice. So let's get started with a general question about the article. How would you summarize fraternal pluralism for undergraduates new to the topic today?
There are a couple of different moves I'm trying to make in the article. One is to situate the recent developments from Pope Francis and recent Catholic scholars around pluralism into the broader context of Catholic social thought and Catholic history. I think it's too easy for news stories to cover every development as though it comes out of absolutely nowhere or it's revolutionary, radical new changes. There are certainly developments that happen, and some of those can be super important. But Catholicism places such a high premium on continuity and on the big picture of things that I think it's important to look for precedent and for traditions that help to inform the conversations that are going on today. So that's one move. Another is I want to expand the conversation around what counts as pluralism. When people talk about pluralism, they tend to see it in one of two lights. One is either sort of a relativist, deconstructionist approach to religion, that in our modern era, old distinctions and differences just get washed over into a sort of broad universalism. Other folks tend to see pluralism very minimally and might define it just as, well, there's different groups in society because we have airplanes now and some degree of immigration, right? And so there's just people living alongside each other. What I wanted to do is draw out a thread that I see in current Catholic thinking about this, at least church hierarchical thinking about this, which is there's a way to have real differences and have those be the basis for real encounter. So it's more than just mere coexistence in the sense of here's the church, here's other people, and they happen to go to the same grocery store. It is a real brotherly or fraternal encounter. There is a desire to reach out and have there be love. And yet it's a love that respects the integrity of different ways of seeing things. The church is not saying we're living in the age of Aquarius or in the new era and there's no longer any difference. At the end of the day, we all believe the same thing. The church is rather saying, no, Catholicism and different religions do believe different things. And also, we should learn to love each other. I think that's a real challenge for the world today, even beyond just Catholicism or religion, is how do we have real, serious differences and sometimes disagreements, and also be able to encounter each other in a loving and respectful way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I can see often when I introduce pluralism, religious pluralism in classes, I admit we have to admit that yes, our current 21st century is certainly a different level of pluralism, but people of different cultures and religions have been living alongside each other since time immemorial, since there was recorded history, right? And there's travel, there's time, there's a trade route and empire building that was always bringing people together. Certainly, it's a different level, but I don't think we should assume that we're living in a totally radically different point. But then also your other point is I think it's really helpful about, especially as everyone who follows the news or is paying attention. We live in a polarized context, polarized world, and so how do we do this successfully? I think is really important, which is the import of your article as well. Um, so let's look at that continuity of tradition you mentioned. Um, I get from your article that you did desire to ground fraternal pluralism, in particular Francis's 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti, in a larger Catholic tradition. Um, could you maybe expand on this? Does this desire to ground the tradition come from any particular experience or observation or study you were doing at the time?
That's a good
You
question.
mentioned, you mentioned news stories, which I think is an interesting point. Yeah.
Well, it does. There's two different challenges that are posed to sort of the type of pluralism that Catholic authorities have promoted over the past couple of decades.
Mm-hmm.
One challenge comes from folks who say that, again, differences have to be overcome, that there has to be radical change within church thinking in order to accommodate the
Mm-hmm.
realities of difference. That really, if we stick to a conserving ideas and values that came from the past, those are going to be obstacles to uniting. And so we need radical change in order to meet the current moment. We have to deconstruct a lot of really core principles of Catholic thinking. We have to deconstruct a reliance on capital T tradition, or the idea that certain decisions made in the past are binding today. We have to flatten out church hierarchy, and we have to be uncomfortable with particular claims that say Jesus is God in a authoritative and final way, and that the scriptures contain revelation. That these are problems for pluralism. That is one challenge that exists. At the other end of, as you might think of it, the horseshoe, you have traditionalists who say they're absolutely correct that Catholicism, as traditionally understood, is incompatible with pluralism, and so we should stick with Catholicism. We should revisit the church's very friendly approach to other religious groups and to dissenters and to other people that we've adopted in the past half a century plus, and say that, in fact, the older ways were better. We should react with hostility. We should seek to promote legal restrictions on other people and use government coercion, because to do anything less is not faithful to Catholicism. So I see both of these as problems. Um, there have been real changes in how the church thinks about the other, defined broadly. But there's been a lot of continuities too. And in a lot of ways, these are natural outgrowths that I think are supported by scripture and tradition, the two sort of main pillars that the church looks to when figuring out what it believes. So, what I wanted to do with this paper is respond to both of those sides of the debate and tell the very hardcore traditionalist folks, look, there are ways in which the modern approach, in fact, aligns very nicely with long honored principles and with the origins of our faith. And to tell some of the more modernist folks, don't think that you have to reinvent the wheel and reinvent Christianity from scratch in order to meet the current moment. There are resources here that are important, that are impactful, and in a lot of ways, the church's creative reception of the past has allowed it to meet this current moment in a way that I think is well suited to what God is up to in the world today and what the world's challenges are.
That's fascinating. The horseshoe you're mentioning, sort of one side is just get rid of tradition; it's not compatible. The other side, sort of doubling down on certain versions or interpretations of tradition, and enforcing it in a certain way that they're like, you're right, it isn't compatible, and tradition's better, right? In a way. But yeah, I think you see this that what you're trying to do, it seems to say, telling both sides, well, well, actually, there's moments, there's continuity, right, as well. And I see this often in just the last, we're now at last three popes, right? I mean, people often pointed to Pope Francis as saying something radically different than Pope Benedict, but when you actually read Pope Benedict's works, there's much of it that is in continuity, and whether it's Pope Francis' Pope approach to poverty or the ecological crisis or immigration, you find that all in Pope Benedict, maybe emphasized differently, but it's all in his work too. I mean, that's another way to think about too.
You had me review a recent book
Oh yeah,
on
yeah.
Pope Benedict's, previously Cardinal Ratzinger's, thoughts on religious pluralism. And one of the themes that comes through is Pope Benedict gets written an awful lot of times as being a super conservative, hidebound, hardcore traditionalist. And that's really not an accurate way of describing his thinking. I think a lot about his address to the officials at the Vatican, the Curia, back at Christmas some years ago, where he talked about a hermeneutic or a way of reading recent changes, especially around the Second Vatican Council, in terms of both continuity and change. And he talked about how there is a dynamism in the life of the church. It would be silly to say that Catholicism today looks exactly the same as it did in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. Because there is a dynamism in the life of the church. There are intellectual developments that happen. But he said that we need to understand those as coming from the same spirit, from the same God, addressed to the same church that existed in the 1880s and in the 30s AD. That this is just a part of the life of Christianity. And he has a very well thought out theological account of that, one that Pope Francis picked up on. Pope Francis looked um, at early Christian scholars. I believe it was St. Irenaeus of Lyon, if I remember correctly, who he relied on for a metaphor of how the church is like a tree. And you can see two things that are going on with a tree. Sometimes a tree just grows new buds and branches, and that's natural. That's life. If you're not doing that, you're not alive. Mm. But he said sometimes you do have diseased or deformed branches that can happen as well, and that's where you have corruptions. And so being able to to distinguish between genuine developments and corruptions is important. To just circle back a little bit to your earlier question, because I do think that it's a card worth showing here. So part of my motivation for taking the tack I have is not just because I look for common ground and try to make everybody somewhat happy and somewhat unhappy, although that's probably true of me as well. But my own Catholic faith is one that, as I was converting, I identified as very traditional and very conservative in a lot of ways, in that I accepted very, very early on into the process of becoming actively Catholic. And I should say I was raised a non-practicing Catholic for the most part. But I accepted very early on the importance of the church's authority, that the church and the Pope and councils of the church have the authority from God to define what is genuinely in accordance with divine revelation and God's will. And looking at it from a New England background that I grew up in, for me, that was a very conservative turn in my thinking. And there are ways in which it has continued to make me very much conservative. But there are others in which it has made me very skeptical of the traditionalist folks who sometimes I think they're more Catholic than the Pope. Mm-hmm. And will say that, well, you see, Pope John Paul II could never do this because in 1492, in footnote number 8 of this document, Pope Urban said this, and therefore it can never change. I see that as troubling disobedience or sedition sometimes as well, that it is an attitude of holier than thou and of a way of closing off those developments that I do believe God properly entrusts to the church. So that is part of why I am trying to thread the needle here, and why, yes, my article certainly is meant to defend the sort of method that the hierarchs and especially the popes have taken, is because my very conservative commitment to their authority also makes me somewhat skeptical of those who say that they can't see things or reword things or rethink things in new ways.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, I'm currently, you're familiar with Hans von Balthasar. I'm not going to go into the weeds right now with him, but I have been rereading one of his essays, The Place of Theology, which, once again, Balthasar is another figure that sort of is um, one of the pillars of people who consider themselves traditionalists, and even he himself in that lovely essay demonstrates, the pronouncements of previous councils, they're authoritative, but they shouldn't just be a pillow on which to rest your theologian's head, right? There will be development, and the way the Holy Spirit speaks back then is different than it's now, and so there is sort of dynamism of a living tradition, an ongoing sort of revelatory event that occurs. That's always happening, and so I do think, yeah, tradition, we imagine it as this sort of like um, uh, solid, like a monolithic rock that is sort of never sort of moving at all, but its tradition is always sort of shifting in dynamism, not in a way that still maintains continuity, as you said. So I think that's helpful to think about.
And I should say, I got to correct myself. It was St. Vincent of Leron, not St. Irenaeus of Lyon,
Yeah,
who gave that metaphor about development and who Pope Francis looked
yeah,
to a lot. One of the phrases that Pope Francis used in the context about disputes over the liturgy, which is a whole other can of worms, and I have opinions about that, but we're not going to get into all that today,
yeah.
is that the church is the custodian of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very Catholic way of putting it,
Mm-hmm.
certainly one that I'm very amenable to.
Yeah, and for the listeners, I'll put in the show notes. I'll put a link to Matthew's review of that book about Ratzinger and pluralism, and I'll put the place of theology. So things we mentioned, we're going to put on a little reading list too. So let's get to the article, the nuts and bolts of it, if you will. Um, so you distinguish thick and thin pluralism. Maybe you can explain the place of thick and thin pluralism, maybe using examples of Hick or Knitter, just to sort of get us going. And then once you do that, I will ask you to briefly look at sort of like non-Christian, non-Catholic, Christian, and dissenting Catholics as sort of case studies. So, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So sociologists distinguish sometimes between thin and thick pluralism. Thin pluralism is sort of just a descriptor. If you have a society where there's multiple groups living alongside each other, that is pluralism, and that
Mm-hmm.
is a descriptive way of talking about the state of a society. Every society has some degree of pluralism.
Yeah.
Obviously, humans are different, and so there's
Yeah.
always some measure of that. I
This
mean,
kind,
even within our
is this kind of like de facto pluralism? Like there is pluralism basically.
de facto is a really good way to put it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's unavoidable in human condition. There's this great old Jewish saying, two Jews, three opinions, right? I mean, even within ourselves, we're divided. Pluralism is just a reality that we have to cope with. Thick pluralism is some sort of normative gloss, some sort of way of looking at pluralism as a starting point for good things, as an opening, as having potential for a meeting across differences in a way that's fruitful, as some sort of good thing. So thick pluralism is normative, right? It's a argument for enthusiasm
Mm-hmm.
about pluralism. It can take a lot of different forms. Like I mentioned earlier, some of it can involve pushes to, you know what, let's deconstruct whatever we came in with and let's find new common ground together. Others are, let's find some sort of encounter model where we have these differences, but we're going to find a way to celebrate them or to seek out common ground.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is some sort of positive embrace of the reality of pluralism. So, fraternal pluralism, which is how I describe the state of what the Catholic Church is up to with pluralism these days, is definitely a thick variety of it.
Yeah.
The church doesn't just begrudgingly say, well, nowadays we have airplanes and national border crossing, and so this is something we have to tolerate. The church is pretty enthusiastic about pluralism as having potential, the potential to inspire new thinking about humanity and about God and about different groups among us that we should be learning from each other. And Fratelli Tutti is a full blown trumpet blast. Pluralism is awesome, and here's all the really cool
Yeah.
things that we should celebrate about it, and here's why it's part of God's plan, and this is great.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I did in the paper was case studies is a good way of talking about it. I looked at three different modes or flavors of Catholic thinking about pluralism. One is in terms of how do Catholics approach non-Christians, just people who practice other religions entirely. Another is how do Catholics look at other Christians who share certain aspects of faith with us and have other differences. And obviously, there's a lot of history there that was quite tense and has generated a lot of conflict over the centuries. And then the third is what about toward maybe nominal Catholics or people who are baptized Catholic, maybe people who are practicing Catholicism in
Mm-hmm.
some ways and not in others, but who dissent from the church's teachings on various issues. How does the church approach them? And I found different themes in how the church sees those three different groups. And it's interesting, and maybe this makes so much common sense that it can be hard to see it academically sometimes. But as you get closer to Catholicism, sometimes the difficulties can actually be greater. Sometimes it can be easier for the Catholic Church to look at Hindus and go like, "You guys are doing your own thing," and like, there's stuff that we have common ground on, and we celebrate that. Whereas somebody who is maybe even attending mass regularly, but who disagrees with the church on some moral issue, that can sometimes present thornier issues. So what I tried to do in the course of the paper is explore in different slices what is the church up to nowadays and what are some precedents for that again in church tradition as well as ultimately in the New Testament and scripture and in the ministry of Jesus and how did he deal with these issues.
Great, great. Did you want to like maybe take out one or two case studies historically that you drew upon in terms of like non-Christians or maybe non-Catholic Christians or dissenting Catholics, and maybe just give an example so that we can think about it together?
Sure, a really neat clean case study in terms of dissenters, people who might be Catholic but may not agree with everything the Catholic Church says, is one that I explored in my paper around Massachusetts's arguments about the legalization of artificial birth control,
Oh
of
yeah. Hmm.
contraception, back in the mid 1900s. So Massachusetts did not allow for birth control to be prescribed or sold within the state for the early part of the 20th century. The U.S. Supreme Court had not yet struck down laws of that nature as unconstitutional, as it ultimately would do a few years later. Initially in the 1940s, there was a push to legalize contraception. Cardinal Cushing, who was the Archbishop of Boston at the time, led the church's campaign against that and said that it would be dangerous to public morals and a decline in public culture, and convinced Massachusetts voters to reject that effort in the 1940s. Fast forward a few years to the 1960s. There's a renewed effort to try to revisit the issue legislatively. This is actually happening at the same time as the Second Vatican Council is. Cardinal Cushing is participating in council discussions while thinking through what the church's response is going to be to this new, renewed initiative in Massachusetts. He initially refrains from comment and affirms that the church continues to believe that birth control, artificial birth control, is immoral and
Mm.
not an acceptable option for Catholics. The church issues its Declaration on Religious Freedom, which is about the freedom of people in a modern society to be immune from government coercion in religious matters. It is focused on freedom to worship and freedom to exercise faith and freedom of conscience. But in the course of articulating that, it gives a long defense of the importance of personal conscience in a diverse, free society. Cardinal Cushing, reflecting on this, says the Catholic Church in Massachusetts is going to accept the fact that there is moral and ethical pluralism among the people of Massachusetts, and that there are people who, in good faith, not good in the sense of correct magisterially approved Catholic faith, but good faith in the sense of honest in their own convictions, who want access to artificial birth control. Not only did he remove the church's opposition to it, he actually accepted a Boston College Jesuit school professor becoming the lobbyist for Planned Parenthood of Massachusetts to go and push for this at the Massachusetts state legislature. He backed the bill. It ended up passing and legalizing contraception.
Hmm.
So this is, and he was very, very explicit about the reason why his views changed were out of respect for the conscience of other people in a free society. That the church wasn't going to impose its own moral concerns on others who did not share those beliefs.
So this was happening in the 1960s, if I recall right. You
It
mentioned
is.
it's a great case study because you have uh, so two things I'm recalling, as my various Catholic social teaching professors from undergraduate and my own work. It's like you always explain to students too, like Catholic social teaching is not meant to replace conscience, but just form it, right? That's it's not supposed to replace your own conscience, right? Um, and secondly, what I'm thinking about is how many fast forward, right, 50 years or even the last 2 decades, right? How many sort of self-describing or Catholic politicians, elected officials, who can who align in terms of the pro-choice argument, but even if personally they are pro-life, I mean, it's almost like they're replicating Cushing's position, right? I mean, they're saying, I'm pro-life, but I'm not going to enforce it on everyone. Is that the case? Or I mean, there seems to be a parallel there with some Catholic Democrats even today, right? Um,
At a superficial level, I
on
think
a
so, but I
superficial
think
level,
it's
yeah, yeah.
well, but I think it's important to look at the nature of what the church is claiming because the church has, and I point this out in the paper as well, the church has threaded the needle. The church has made no pushes to recriminalize contraception anywhere.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And the church, since the 1980s, has actually been calling on governments to stop criminalizing homosexual intimacy.
Mm-hmm,
There is this sense consistently within the church's teaching that there are matters that are just private concerns and that the government shouldn't be coercing people in those matters. And I know that the criminalization of homosexuality in the United States is no longer a live issue, but in a lot of places where the church is very active, it really is. This is a major issue in Africa and other places. So the church has not stopped doing that. Nevertheless, the abortion context, I think, pushed the church to see the limits of that kind of thinking, in that it is a stance the church is willing to take that, look, your own decisions about sexuality in private are not a matter of government concern. But once you have what the church believes to be a human victim here, it ceases to be a matter of just private activity. And that's why the church has continued to insist that no, governments should, in fact,
yeah.
criminalize abortion and should outlaw it. Cardinal Cushing passed away a little bit before Roe v. Wade, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd be very interested to have seen how he would have reacted to that. But there were a number of folks who reacted, I think, the way the church did, which is to say that a lot of the church's concerns about legalizing contraception were pretty specific to Catholic thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When the church was able to see a broader sort of neutral reason or secular case against abortion, one that involved more philosophy and less theology, particularly, the church gave less room for disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that makes sense, if it is simply a matter of sin, yeah, the church is fairly comfortable saying that if it's a private concern, then toleration is the appropriate way of respecting conscience within a society. If it crosses the line into being an immoral act, but one that harms other people, that's where the church is still willing to put its foot down and be less, um, well, rosy about
Mm-hmm.
pluralism.
Yeah.
And I should add as well, um, the church also distinguishes between going to the mat for civil toleration versus moral relativism within the church.
Mm-hmm.
The church has never backed down from saying that using contraceptives or engaging in same sex intimacy or any of those things are severe, grave sins that the Catholic priests should not be teaching from the pulpit, that Catholics should not be organizing on and support of, and that if a Catholic does, they should go into confession. So it's not that the church has watered down its own teachings internally on this. It is sort of this recognition, though, that society writ large, society outside of the church, is a place of pluralism. And then that analogy sometimes carries over and sometimes doesn't so much into the internal life of the church. And we can talk more about
Yeah, we'll talk
those
about that
issues as
towards
well.
the end, definitely, that sort of
Sure.
internal, external. Well, let's we're talking about these sort of culture, social, political topics that let's maybe move. Let's do a present day case study about this, right? As you know, there have been several public disagreements between Catholic politicians, even the current Vice President J.D. Vance, and members of the Catholic hierarchy, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and even two different popes now, um, regarding, in particular, immigration enforcement is a good example of a contemporary issue now, right? So, how might fraternal pluralism relate to the current polarized views regarding immigration law and immigration enforcement in the United States vis-a-vis Catholic social teaching? Because Catholic social teaching, as you're well aware, what trying to thread that needle, that line between one side or the other, saying, obviously, of course, in our current, you know, um, makeup in how we understand geopolitical borders and nation states, yes, you have a right to sort of have protect your borders, if so on. But any sort of protection or enforcement of borders always needs to be through the lens of inherent and inviolable human dignity, right? And so a lot of the ways people enforce immigration law could, in fact, be contrary to human dignity. And there's been not so private, rather very public disagreements between Catholic magisterial teachings in terms of the way bishops and cardinals and even the popes are saying, and Catholic politicians trying to make the case for what is happening in the United States currently is totally in line with Catholic social teaching. And here's why, right? But it seems like fraternal pluralism is another example of of how this could make sense of this current context. So
I think it's a way to think about it. Certainly, there's this expectation from the bishops that Catholic politicians need to think about immigration policy, whatever way they come down in terms of the specifics, by keeping in mind the importance of fraternity, of solidarity with the poor, of respect for the dignity of the human person and of the rule of law. They reject this sort of us against them, dividing, drawing bright lines between legals and illegals, and it's sort of very harsh measures that can affect families
mm-hmm.
and communities and people and workplaces and things like that. So there's this sense from the bishops that, look, fraternity has to be a part of this, and you can have fraternity with borders, but it can't look like the sort of rabble rousing, they're all going to, they're the filthy disease-ridden criminal masses who are coming here to destroy our country, and they're the enemy, and we're going to take a war footing. That's just not compatible with fraternity among human beings in different groups.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the interesting things that has emerged in this debate, there are certain places where the church is very black and white. And we'll say, for example, the death penalty is simply wrong, and it is a sin to engage in it. Or even more clearly, abortion. You see, even Catholic heads of state get denied communion from bishops if they back legislation around abortion. Then you have issues that are not so absolute. Like you said, Catholic social teaching accepts the permissibility of having national borders and having some immigration controls. The church doesn't have an absolute stance that you can never, ever do this.
And in fact, having those borders in control is could be safer. I mean, it helps human trafficking, right? You have checks to see who's going where, so you can track people, so that because a lot of terrible things could be happening too, right? That violates. So the tracking is also part of, in a sense, could be part of protecting human dignity, right?
And so can other social values. I mean, the United States is one context. The church, when it speaks about issues, is speaking about all contexts simultaneously. There are countries that could not handle a massive influx of millions of people from the next country over and still sustain their basic culture or their economy or other things like that. Those are fair concerns to have. Indeed, in the United States, there are communities that have hit some of their maximum carrying load as far as brand new people showing up. So these are issues that involve prudential judgment calls, and the church recognizes that. So Pope Benedict talked about how in issues like war, and I am certain he would include immigration in this list as well, there can be legitimate disagreements with what the bishops are saying or what the Pope says even. in specific cases because different people assess particular contexts differently. And Pope Benedict said that's why we don't just go around excommunicating every politician who supports a war, because there's just too many variables there. But the church also doesn't stay totally silent on those. The church is willing to put its institutional voice in the middle of those debates and to still say, hey, look, here are important principles that certainly have our prudential standing as citizens, as another voice in society. We're willing to come forward and say, we think you've gotten this totally wrong and you need to rethink this. It's not that we're going to excommunicate you. It's not, this is the price of being Catholic, is that, this is whether or not you're in good standing with the church. But it is, look, to the extent that you as a Catholic take us seriously morally, as you ought to, here's our voice, here's our perspective, here's our thoughts about this. Sometimes here's our expertise. Certainly the church is involved in missions among people on the margins of society in ways that can sometimes translate to them having a perspective that's very helpful. One place where we've seen some movement, actually, of an issue from one side of that line toward a more absolute stance is the death penalty. Pope Francis, a few years ago, changed the language in the Catechism. The Catechism of the Catholic Church said that in modern society, the death penalty is not necessary and therefore is not justifiable. Pope Francis changed that language to say that the death penalty is no longer admissible in modern society and that the church works diligently for its abolition. There's been a lot of ink spilled about what exactly inadmissible means, because it's not a term that comes up a whole lot in Catholic social teaching. I think one valid interpretation of that is to say that Pope Francis was pushing this closer toward this is no longer an area of prudential disagreement and give and take, and not necessarily saying here come the excommunications tomorrow and you're not going to get communion anymore, but pushing in that direction and saying, look, this is a place where the church's internal ways of dealing with dissent are getting tighter. And let me tie that back up with the idea of fraternalism or fraternity. Thinking at a very simple level, to be fraternal toward my neighbor and to be fraternal toward my literal brother is a very, very different thing, right? There's all kinds of things that I probably should talk to members of my own literal family about, sometimes involving even correction or hard talk in ways that I wouldn't do with a neighbor or the stranger in my town. Sometimes being a good brother to an actual brother is different than being a good brotherly person to somebody who's a little bit farther out. So to come back to what I started off with, sometimes as you get closer and closer to people who identify with Catholicism and practice Catholicism, there actually can be less room for sort of fully embraced disagreement in the way that, like, the Catholic Church isn't going to tell Buddhists how to be Buddhists, right? But the Catholic Church is going to tell Catholics how to be Catholic. I don't think that's a contradiction, but I understand that it is counterintuitive for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I know. I understand that because they're making claims about identifying with a particular faith tradition, and so if that claim is taken seriously, then the assumption is that, well, here's what that tradition has to say. I mean, you could take it or leave it, of course, but it is there to be formed.
And there comes a point where the church will say, look, if you leave it, we're not going to ask the government to come and jail you as a heretic. Like, that's fine. That's your prerogative. But you do kind of need to make that choice. It's sometimes either you're at the table and you're part of this tradition, or you're just not.
Yeah.
So those are some of the tensions that are coming up in all of these contexts. And of course, these are all just a couple of hot button political issue contexts rather than all the theology ones and other liturgical ones and
of course,
other ones that come up as well. The Catholic Church and the Traditionalist Society of St. Pius X are headed for a major showdown this summer. The society has said that, like in the 1980s, it plans to consecrate its own bishops without papal approval. They did that in the 80s. They got excommunicated, and that's been lifted, but now here we go again.
Yeah, and that's another sort of, that's like another horseshoe, if you will, right? Because it's excommunicated that society, which is very traditionalist. It's also excommunicated, other people who've ordained women, for instance, right? So, like, it's sort of both sides effectively are being sort of the guardrails, I suppose, are there.
But I think again, one of the remarkable things is I don't think a lot of people assume that a group that does that sort of active discipline and has pretty strong stances on, like, look, here's the things that we believe, would also be capable of sitting down at World Day of Prayer meetings alongside Hindu monks and Buddhists and Jewish rabbis and imams and praying together.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
that's what I think is somewhat remarkable about Catholicism. It can do both.
yeah. I think perhaps I don't know if this relates to that point, right? Because like I said, on the one side, Catholic intellectual tradition has a tremendous amount of inclusivism, inclusive pluralism in terms of not only tolerating but appreciating and affirming and valuing and learning from other religious, cultural traditions historically, and so on and so forth, and being challenged by them and even rethinking things. On the other hand, it does have some hard and fast sort of like boundaries that it keeps in terms of what makes it. Of course, any religion tends to be, if it's survived for millennia, has to be conservative in the neutral sense of conserving something from the past, not in the political or other side sense. It just has to conserve some things. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist anymore. And so I guess this has to do with, um, at one point you suggest that fraternal pluralism is here to stay as a way in which the Catholic Church relates to non Christians, non Catholic Christians, even dissenting Catholics, which is the idea of sitting down at the table and still talking and trying to figure things out, right? However, you also suggest that fraternal pluralism is unlikely to be adopted internally. Maybe you can give that distinction a little bit. What does that mean?
That may have been an oversimplification in terms of how I phrased that.
Sure, sure.
But what I did want to point to is I don't see the church just saying within the Church of England, there's this movement over the past couple centuries called latitudinarianism.
Mm-hmm.
English are amazing at kind of 8 syllable words to do with religion, disestablishmentarian and latitudinarian. Latitudinarianism said, look, you may not agree with the Church of England on much. You might disagree with other aspects of it in terms of how we do liturgy and how we practice. You may disagree with it in terms of moral teachings. You may disagree with it in terms of what the structure should look like. It's really a big deal. Like, as long as you're interested in being with us, you're good.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a place within sort of Anglicanism writ large. And that has allowed the Church of England to maintain sort of high church and low church and evangelical and magisterial and various different branches within it.
Mm-hmm.
But there comes a day when that becomes really difficult. And indeed, the African bishops, a large proportion of them, just said that they are not accepting the current Archbishop of Canterbury,
Yeah.
the new one. And a number of leading Anglican thinkers have broken off into a separate confederation. Some of the American Anglicans now are supervised by bishops out of Africa because they don't accept their local bishops. A number of others have ditched it entirely and become Catholics or otherwise just found their own place. The Anglican Church in North America is now a separate thing that has some cultural commonalities but is not part of the worldwide Anglican communion. I don't see the Catholic Church going that route and saying, look, well, whatever you think is just kind of fair game. Um, or even that being fraternal means that we are going to tolerate wider and wider divergences on key moral questions. Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, right, the big champion of this, had to contend over the past couple of years with Germany's what's called the Synodal Way,
Mm-hmm.
which was an effort by the Germans to create a body made up of bishops and lay people where a majority vote, including just of the lay people, could change how the church did poor things, like extending same sex blessings or having women preach the homilies on Sundays. Other big, big changes. Pope Francis condemned this and said Germany already has a Protestant church, and this one won't be as good as that one. That's pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty hard line in the sand, but he had no enthusiasm for this. And by the way, this is at the same time as Pope Francis is introducing a process called synodality throughout the church to bring together bishops to talk with lay people about things. So he certainly wanted to encourage discourse and dialogue and conversation. He also very clearly drew a line in the sand and said, look, we're not going to turn into a giant council church that's putting everything up to a vote and where, if Germany wants to do its thing and approve assisted suicide in its hospitals, that's cool. And if the bishops down in Nigeria don't want to do that, that's their prerogative. That's not at all the direction that Pope Francis was comfortable going. And if Pope Francis wasn't comfortable with it, then yeah, I can't see any Catholic hierarchy going further than that.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and even though in that case, it may have been about the decisions they were going to make, or may not have been, but it was for sure about the process by which they made those decisions. For all, some of those, does that make sense?
absolutely.
Yeah,
One of the questions that came up was, can women be ordained to the diaconate?
yeah,
Pope Francis has commissioned a study group to look into this. Again, there's been several research projects done on it in recent years. He said, like, look, I'm not saying that the answer is absolutely going to be no. I am saying that, like, Germany's not about to go secede and do its own
yeah.
thing. We're not going to do a German Catholic Church that is separate from the Mexican and the Vietnamese and the Vatican Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Like, this
I
is
mean,
not a way that's going to go.
in the Anglican example, or even maybe Episcopalian, the United States example, or other examples you can give, it made in your article also made me think about. Are you familiar in sociology of the bridge bonding dilemma? Um, if not, that's fine. I
Not
kind of
under
am
those
familiar.
terms, at least.
What's that?
Not by that name. If I do know what it is, I'm not
I think you
sure.
might
But
know what it is, and because I'll explain it sort of, I'll paraphrase from what I understand. It's this dilemma within when you create sort of in groups and out groups in society, any kind, right? Religious, ethnic, nationalist, right? The more you cultivate a bridge towards people not in your group, which is great, you would say it's wonderful. The danger is that may come at a cost of a sense of bonding with people in your group, and the more you emphasize bonding with your in group, which is creates a good bond, and you get along when you're all part of the same culture or religion or language or whatever, fine. But the more you bond, the less of a wider bridge you have to others. So there's sort of this dilemma, right? And I see that in some denominations or others, like sure you have a great bridge, but how much of a bond do you have? Or then you see some people who are nationalists, like sure you have a great bond, but man, you have no bridge now, right? In this case.
yeah, I think that's true. And Catholicism, I think, presents a very complicated possible counterexample to
Mm-hmm.
that for a variety of reasons. It is a complicated thing, but the commitment on some level to at least institutional discipline, I think, actually provides there for space for both bridges and
Mm-hmm.
bondings, and that the popes are able to say you can always find the pope, right? If you want to bond around something, by golly, you can always find out where he's at and
Mm-hmm.
call him. Not that every Catholic places that at the center, but as a center of gravity for the tradition. I mean, having a person who has, at least in theory, authoritative, and in the beliefs of many of us, authoritative say over what's in and what's out, provides that bonding position. But also,
Yeah.
if that bonder decides to extend bridges or says that, look, these are bridges that we have and that we have to have, that I think gives a lot of us the space to say, like, yeah, you know what? I defend these things on their own. I love the bridges because I'm bonded,
Mm-hmm.
and that gives space for this. And so, like I said, I see the two threats to it: the universalist threat and the traditionalist threat. The traditionalists say, we got to be bonded, and this is all crazy, and the universalists say, well, actually, the irony of the traditionalist position, though, is they want to undo the bond that centers on the Pope,
Mm-hmm.
at least at the extremes. Some of them do want to do that.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is not an option based on what the core commitments of the tradition are, as I understand them. And then on the other side, you have the universalists who, yeah, see that bond as an obstacle to the good bridging. I don't think that they fully appreciate just how many people love the bridges precisely because the bond says that they're okay, because the Pope says it's okay to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more buy-in from folks who I don't think would otherwise join the bridgers.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Great.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's do one other. Let's pivot to another question about your article, some historical examples, and then we'll conclude. Um, so sort of different topic, relevant to fraternal pluralism. So this is from section 3. Um, you say fraternal pluralism means seeking Christian unity in a certain way, maybe that bond, right? You offer some examples in which the search for Christian unity often, and this is more ecumenical Christian unity, right? Unity resulted in intolerance and even in the justification of certain acts of violence, whether it's Augustine's compulsion of the Donatist Christians to return to the church, or the very unfortunate alliance of Protestants, some Protestants and some Catholics under the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, right? There was a bonding going on, a unity going on, but it was not a healthy one, and certainly one that shouldn't have happened. What do you think are some guardrails, maybe theological, political, or otherwise, that could prevent the desire for Christian unity from regressing into intolerance for difference, for example? I don't know. It's a big question, but
I mean, for one, certainly that, and I'll take that maybe in order of the two examples that you
yeah,
gave. The disavowal of physical coercion by the government is really, really important
yeah,
here, right? That's what the problem was with Donatism. Scholars debate whether the Donatists may have actually been more violent than
I've heard this
some
too.
other
Yeah,
records suggest. Maybe there
yeah,
were other rationales for
yeah.
Augustine's call to coerce them. That's unclear, and I'm not an expert in that North African context.
Mm-hmm.
Setting that aside, though, certainly the ability to say, look, the church will go as far as excommunicating you. And if you believe what the church believes, that is, in fact, a bigger deal than getting
Mm-hmm.
thrown in prison. But the church is not going to use or call upon the government or allow the government to use physical coercion to punish you. The church is going to allow you to have space in society still, civil society,
Mm-hmm.
the city of man, as Augustine would put it. That's really important. That is a critical guardrail, because it allows there to continue to be dialogue and
Mm-hmm.
discussion and space, and it allows people to, as Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, and I can stand nowhere else." All right, that here may not be somewhere the church is willing to say is within the bounds of the church, but you can stand somewhere without getting set on fire or executed or whatever else it may be. And
Yeah.
I think that is a absolutely critical guardrail, is to preserve that space in society writ large. Also, when that conversation continues, you can find your ways back to connections on the far side of that. The Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation, back some years ago, issued a document about common understandings of justification and salvation, which was one of the big breaking points of Martin Luther and the church authorities in his day. That was only possible because, indeed, the church isn't out there hunting down the Lutherans, right?
Yeah.
So that's a important guardrail. Um, to turn to your other example, I think I need you to refresh my memory as to
Thus,
what it
the
was.
alliance between some Protestants and some
Hmm.
Catholics under the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah, how do
Ostensibly
you
for Christian unity, but like, that's the wrong thing to unite around, you know? Um,
Right. Well, Christianity understood as an identity, and especially as a political identity, as the marker of who's in and who's out in the city of man or in secular society, is a dangerous thing.
mm-hmm.
Um, there's been a lot written about Christian nationalism. I don't think there are actually as many Christian nationalists out there as some scholars seem to define them as, but there is a tendency out there that says that, look, this is a Christian nation and Christianity is normative. Being American and being Christian are inseparable, things like that. From a theology standpoint, I think the best response to that is to just return to the gospel originally, which is Jesus didn't draw these hard lines. Jesus didn't say that who is nearest to God are the people who identify as one school of Judaism or even necessarily as Jews. He was perfectly happy to say that he found faith in a Roman centurion, who presumably was a pagan,
and
that he
presume
hadn't seen.
and the oppressor at the time, effectively, right? I mean, the occupier. You know?
At least the civil authority from another country.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to say I have found faith in him that I had not seen among Jews. When he's talking to Samaritans, who were seen as the heretic par excellence by the Jews, he said, the day is coming when we're not going to be worshiping in Jerusalem and we're not going to be worshiping on the mountain. Rather, God desires those who worship in spirit and in truth. So the example of Christ himself and of St. Paul, when he goes to the Areopagus in Athens and finds an altar inscribed to an unknown God,
Mm-hmm.
and says, let me tell you more about this God and what I believe about him, but recognizes that there is indeed some commonality there. So I think it's important to not let Christianity become a civil identity or a marker of civil identity. I think that's an important safeguard. And another, I think, is to really lean in and excavate more of those parts of the gospel and of Christian tradition where, look, prostitutes and tax collectors are storming heaven while you, the priests and whatnot, are out. That's got a lesson for us
Yeah. Yeah.
around who's in and who's out. um, and what that means, and our inability to know that based on visible things in this life about
Yeah.
other people. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
there are many who are first who will be last. There are many who are last who will be first, and some degree of healthy mystery and reverence for God's role in that, I think, is a really, really important safeguard against that idea that, look, everybody's got to be, be that how perfectly Catholic identified or Christian identified you are determines how good you are before God, and
Yeah.
therefore should also determine your role in civil society.
Great. For the last like 5 minutes here, I do want to turn to some more personal, professional sort of
Sure.
questions. So one is curious how your own path, it's academic, spiritual, professional, may have shaped your understanding of fraternal pluralism or vice versa. I know you served as a public defender, for instance. I imagine that requires a certain amount of fraternal pluralism in terms of you're defending people who may have been accused of things. And so I don't know. Is am I right in assuming that or not? Or maybe you can even connect it now on the fly.
Well, I think fraternal pluralism, it's not a term that I had thought about while acting the public defender, but
Of course, yeah.
certainly what drove a lot of my public defense work was the Catholic belief in the dignity of the human person, that there's a core image of God that people bear and a core invitation from God to communion with Him that doesn't go away no matter what you've done in this life until all is said and done and final judgment happens, and none of us are privy to that in this mortal life. St. Paul says, I don't even judge my own heart because I'm not aware of anything on my conscience, St. Paul says, but I don't even judge myself as far as how right I am before God. So being able to trying to see people in that light was certainly an important part of how I tried to interact with people and be able to see them as more than just the worst things they were accused of doing. Um, I also see upholding the rule of law and personal liberties and the Constitution as an important way of defending that fraternal pluralism among different people in society. That nobody should be left subject to tyranny or to unjustifiable violence, and that the laws that we have, and I think America has very, very strong constitutional values, that defending those is a really important way of protecting people, protecting all of us, but protecting our life together, defending the common good that we have as a society to be able to live peaceably and tolerantly of one another, and that secures the ground for us to be able to encounter one another um,
Mhm.
as free people who are equal in dignity. Um, and indeed, accountability is part of that too. I don't mean to say I never believe that all of my clients deserve automatic acquittals and no consequences for their actions, but fostering a sense of accountability and looking forward to reintegrating somebody into society, rehabilitating them,
Yeah.
helping them to get um, difficulties in their lives addressed. I saw all of that as an important way of certainly recognizing their common humanity, but also just securing that ground for fraternal pluralism as well.
Great, thank you. And then maybe one final question. Um, so I know you concentrated in the comparative study of religion at Harvard. You completed a joint Master of Theological Studies and JD at Emory University. You're a practicing lawyer with scholarly interest in the study of religion and theology. Um, so two questions, maybe you could maybe back to back. One, how did this background maybe influence the writing and research of this article? And secondly, um, you know, what did you see as the benefits of sort of doing a humanities degree first, before going to law school?
As far as this article goes, I see this article as sort of pre-legal context, if that makes sense. So Aristotle talked about how politics, and he would include the making of laws as part of that, is a subset of ethics,
Mm-hmm.
how people should interact, which is a subset of philosophy, which is what is life all about.
Mm-hmm.
That that's certainly a theme the Catholic Church has picked up on,
Yeah.
right? Catholic teaching is all about seeing the big picture of things. But I do believe that the values that society operates on are informed by its understanding of what human life and human people are about, and that those beliefs ultimately rest on theological and philosophical questions. So, when I'm thinking about fraternal pluralism and about the church's ability to have dialogue and appreciate the other and seek common ground and use peaceful means for interacting with others, I definitely do see that as reflecting the same commitments in terms of an understanding of humanity, that should drive how our laws tend to treat things as well.
Yeah.
That there should be room for difference. That the law shouldn't pretend like it's going to resolve all the big issues for us, and that conscience is important. Things like that.
Yeah.
So, as far as the benefits of an education goes, lawyers are called upon to do everything, a little bit of everything. Every lawyer, at some point, if you're doing litigation and getting involved in cases, you have to be a bit of a historian, a bit of a scientist, a little bit of a forensicist, a bit of an economist, a bit of a. We dip in and out of a lot of things. A humanities degree sets you up to be able to think critically and see the big picture in ways that are important. That's one good thing. It's a skill builder. Mm-hmm. For two, it's a principles builder. We have plenty of lawyers who are out there making the world worse because they're using their tremendous talents in order to corrode the rule of law and exploit vulnerable people and be brutal toward them. It's not enough to just be a lawyer. You should want to be a good lawyer. I would hope that people aspire to do the right thing, and thinking long and hard about doing the right things is hopefully something that you get from a humanities degree. Yeah. At least you have no good excuse if you haven't done some critical thinking about the things that you're reading and trying to figure that out in the course of getting one. And as far as immediate practical concerns goes, I had classmates who came from pre-med backgrounds and chemistry backgrounds and music theory backgrounds and linguistics, and law is such a different animal in terms of how you have to think and read and write that you don't need to do pre-law in order to kind of figure it out once you're in there. And I don't know how much that even does really set you up. I think it's weird that in the United States you can't do a law degree for undergrad anymore and just jump straight in, but you can't. So take advantage of that and go study whatever the heck you want to. Do good, be smart, and like that'll get you into law school and certainly count for jobs down the road. Don't feel like you need to marry yourself. If you're seriously thinking about law school, just realize like you'll need to study for the LSAT at some point, but you do not need to have taken XYZ course in undergrad and hit this major in order to be ready to do it. And so that gives a lot of permission to go ahead and get out there and do things. Even for current law students, I will say, one of my mentors put it really well. He said, law school is your last chance at a good liberal arts education. For a lot of lawyers, that's true. Most of what you do as a lawyer, you're going to have to learn on the job anyway. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to take courses in history or in law and literature, or get out there, like broaden your mind. Those are actually the things that you're probably likelier to remember and that are going to have more of a formative impact. You can remember reading Dostoevsky more than you're going to remember what the exact number of days is to file a complaint under the Civil Procedure Code. And one of those, you're going to be able to get ChatGPT to look up for you in 10 seconds flat. The other one's a human experience that you can't get from anywhere else.
All right. I love ending on an AI note. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. For our next show, right? Thank you so much, Matt, for joining me. I really appreciate it.